I have this sort of strong feeling that I am supposed to make myself available for the vulnerable, for the powerless, and for the voiceless. So
That's a fine idea.
This is the one.
The question is, how do you do it?
How do we
Because
do it?
it's hard to do it.
Huge bloody question. Sometimes they don't want me interfering in their
Well,
lives.
there is that.
Majority of the time.
Right.
They
There
are.
certainly is that. Well, there's a maxim that's often applied by people who work in old age homes, which is never do anything for the residents that they can do themselves.
They
Right?
can't steal their own money and have sex with their sleeping body. I'm a comedian.
Very funny.
I don't know why I say things like that. It's paid off over the long run. Yeah, no.
Right, exactly.
So isn't it like?
So it's hard. Like the thing about compassion is it's not sufficient to produce solutions. Compassion is an unbelievably useful emotion if you're dealing with 6-month-old infants.
What
Because
about?
they're always right.
Jeez, they're an arsehole. No, but like you know, like, but what I want
That's
to.
not very compassionate.
You said it doesn't work. No, but what I want to say is, like, I know you're saying all this thing about sort of one of the essential themes, ideas about the Christ myth being, you know, sort of burn away all that cannot be reborn. But bloody hell, mate, in the actual language, all he bangs on about is kindness, kindness, love, love, kindness, kindness, love,
Not
love.
in Revelation. Not in Revelation. He's a judge in Revelation.
What? And you're still taking that as what? Books beyond the Gospels, you're still taking as the word of Christ.
Well, I'm taking them as part of the entire corpus of the story. I mean, the reason that Jung thought Revelation was appended to the Bible was because the Christ in the Gospels was erred too much, in a sense, on the side of mercy and not enough on the side of judgment. Because here's
Discernment
why.
is important.
There's a technical reason, though. It's like,
We don't want a judgmental Jesus.
well, you don't have a choice. Because if you have an ideal, it's a judge. Like, you have an ideal, and there might be an ideal that you have of you. It's simultaneously your judge because you fall short of it.
I understand this because, funny enough, I was talking to the fellow that taught me meditation yesterday, Bob Roth. So he's a student of the Maharishi, you know that. He said that when Maharishi was asked, what is the one principle, he didn't say kindness or compassion or anything like that. He said discernment.
Right.
And discernment, you know, which path are we going to follow? Where is the attention going?
Yeah.
But
that's judgment. That's why in Revelation, Christ divides the damned from the saved, and most are damned. It's discernment. And what that means in some sense is that there's 100,000 ways to do things wrong and only one way to do them right, or maybe only 5 ways of doing them right. But you know that in your own life, is that there's an infinite number of snares that you can tangle yourself up in. And to find that pathway where everything is balanced, that requires continual discernment and attention. And so you can't have an ideal without it being a judge. And you can't live properly without discernment. But that doesn't mean compassion, and compassion isn't relevant. It doesn't mean that at all.
I've got to ask you something that sort of occurs to me. See, like you, have found myself in different types of controversial situations, various conflicts, and much of the time it's because, like Albert Mayswell said, tyranny is the deliberate removal of nuance. People remove. Right. I didn't even say that. That's not what I meant.
That's a good phrase.
It's good shit, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
good. But like the thing, right?
The deliberate removal of nuance. Yeah, that's what makes it different than ignorance, because ignorance, there's no nuance in ignorance, but it's excusable because you just don't know any better.
Yeah.
But when it's deliberate, that's a whole different story. That's very nice. Who said that?
Albert Mays was a filmmaker. He made like Grey Gardens. He made that I did a documentary with him very briefly, and he made that Beatles movie when the Beatles first came to the States. He made Gimme Shelters. The Mayswell's brother, they're like old guys now, brilliant documentarians. I can see our crew here and nodding with approval. He invented much of the fly-in-the-wall verite style that's informed subsequent documentary. Tyranny is the deliberate removal of nuance. I worked with him sort of briefly, filming none other than President Donald Trump of all people. But like one of the things that I wanted to talk about was if I like, this is the thing, I don't like all of the, I agree, or I feel, I don't know what you feel, that you know, that one of the neoliberalism abandoned its allegiance, and leftist politics has in a sense abandoned the working class, and I can understand their rage. But the feeling I personally have is if I sense that I'd said things, and I've done this, so I know, that have offended women, which when I was a single person, I was promiscuous, and I know that that caused me conflagration and conflict, or when I've done things like, in the spirit of humour that have had like a kickback, I've always felt bad if I feel like I've offended people that I would regard, or culturally are regarded as vulnerable.
Yeah.
So, like, around the, when we make the conversation about the use of language, tyranny and oppression in free speech, well, obviously I agree with you. But I do take from, the gospel version of Christ, the idea that kindness, love, we can't, we have to continue to find resources for ongoing, and we'll continue to fail, but we must continue to be loving. So my question is if you have found yourself in a position where I kind of think some people are using you to sort of say, fuck you women, or fuck you transgender people. And for me, I think I would want to sort of go, oh, that's not my bag. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think that, first of all, we'll go to the most fundamental part of the question, which is this issue about love. And like, one of the things I've thought about a fair bit is the meaning of the Sermon on the Mount. And as far as I can tell, it's basically two-part wisdom. The first is that you should aim at the highest good that you can imagine. And that would be a good that includes everyone, right? So if I wanted what was good for you, say, if I genuinely wanted it, I'd want it in a way that was good for you now and good in the long run and good for you and your family and your community and maybe good for me too. You could conceive of that as the desire. And I think that's a good definition of love, is that you actually want the best possible outcome. And in the Gospels, of course, that's extended even to your enemies.
Yes.
Right? Is that, okay, if we're going to have things good, let's have it good enough for even the people that set themselves up against me. Because if the world was running properly, things would be good for them too. And that would be better. And it seems to me that that's a very good way of looking at things. It's a difficult way of looking at things. And then the second part of the Sermon on the Mount is something like, having established that as your aim, which is no easy thing, by the way, right? Because you have to be pretty clear-headed and single-minded to actually want that to be your aim. Then you can concentrate on the day and you can try telling the truth. And you can ally. So there's truth and love that are allied together. Truth, love, and attention. It's something like that are all allied together. With regards to transgressing against the vulnerable, I don't think that is what I've done. I think that people have claimed that, but I don't think there's any evidence for it. I mean, first of all, I know absolutely that I have brought perhaps thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people, but certainly thousands of people away from identification with the right, because they write me all the time and tell me that. I've received about 30,000 letters, specifically from people who've been watching my YouTube videos since August. And 25,000 of them or so, we've tried to count, are from people who said that they were in very dark places and that their lives are much better, much oriented towards truth and responsibility and away from political ideology, mostly on the right, that they were attracted on the right, because I have more people like that write me than people who say that I've, rescued them from the hellholes of the radical left. I think that's more of a historical accident in some wise than anything else. But also with the transgender issue, more specifically, I've received now at least 40 letters from transgender people. And the only one of them was critical. And it wasn't that critical. The rest of them all said, we never signed up to be poster boy of the year for the radical left. And it's been no picnic, believe me. All that's happened is that our lives have become much more difficult. And I believe that. And I don't see that. I think one of the mistakes that the radical left makes, and this is part and parcel of their flirtation with identity politics, is that they fall all over themselves to believe that if a person identifies as a minority, then they immediately have the right to speak for all the people who are in that minority. And that's a claim that I reject completely. I mean, first of all, there is no transgender community. It's not a community. Because a community is constantly interacting and networking and has a shared purpose and all that. Transgender people are just as diverse as any other people. It's like saying, well, there's no real black community. There's not homogenous political viewpoints across the black population.
I suppose so. I agree to a point that these taxonomies are necessarily externally imposed, because how would they be intrinsically experienced? I understand that. But also, it seems to me that there is a thing called the experience of being an African American, and you can put into that high prison populations for young males, lack of educational opportunity or work opportunity. The data is available for that. So while community may be an incorrect term literally, there is a strata that seem to be underserved. And another concern I would have about some of the repurposing, as far as we know so far, of much of your oratory and online work, seems to me that it supports the powerful. It supports hegemony. I don't agree that things are as simple as white men are in a position of power, but I'm only interested in who is able to affect change, who is able to influence, who can you not attack in public, what is possible, who is being controlled. That's what interests me. Okay. So, transnational corporations, economic elites, and how are they served by what I say or by what you say?
Okay, so that's a reference back to the existence of inequality. We agreed earlier
that inequality back
is a
to
big
that
problem. Oh yeah, it's
but you're saying it's natural, which clearly...
Well, it's not. You cannot lay it at the feet of capitalism. That's absolutely clear. And the fact that it's natural...
It ain't bloody helping, though, capitalism.
Make it desirable. What's that?
Capitalism doesn't help. There's so many, Marxist critique. What I understand about it, is that capitalism is built on limitless growth from finite resources, and also capitalism will always be redirected and criminally misused, and the sort of the economics of our time, it sort of for me is demonstrable. I know sort of there are people that say, oh no, people are richer now than ever, but staying in LA for a while and there's 90,000 homeless people in the greater LA area, it seems like some sort of the apocalypse is creeping in.
People are richer than they ever have been, but the extremes of inequality are high too. And there's some evidence. Well, here's an example of how these things might work. So imagine that people are getting richer. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But here's
we got more stuff, even though I'm sure you would agree that
starving. That's one.
Not starving. That's good.
Like obesity is a bigger problem in the world now than starvation. Right. That's a big deal. That's a big plus. But
in a way, it implies that people are being underserved by their operating systems.
But there's no doubt about that.
And it still infers inequality also.
Oh yes. Well, first of all, there's no doubt that any social system has a tyrannical and arbitrary aspect. I mean, that's an archetypal trait. Any, of course. And even well-functioning systems have a tyrannical aspect. Not mostly, or at least merely, because they require conformity.
Native Americans who you're down with, not Native Americans, Native Canadians. Yeah. The qua.
Yeah.
Like them guys. How's their social system set up?
Oh, it's a catastrophe.
Go on.
Oh, well, I mean, it's a catastrophe for all sorts of reasons. I mean,
some catastrophe.
of it... Yeah, it is. It's the situation is very catastrophic. It's partly because, the reserve system was set up in Canada, and it had a possibility of working when there was a possibility that small communities could work economically. But small communities don't work economically anymore. Like if you go through Saskatchewan, for example, a central province in Canada, in the 1960s, there were thousands and thousands of small towns. Mostly Caucasian.
That is because they're done. That's capitalism, though. Huh?
No, it's not. It's deeper than that. It's the same problem. Well,
it might be deeper than it, but in its current form, it is capitalism. Because I would agree that what is capitalism a manifestation of? Greed. You could say.
It's the same thing but the same thing has happened all over the world. Like urbanization is taking place at a tremendously rapid rate. It doesn't matter what the culture is or the form of government.
So you think that the politics is happening at a lower level? The phenomenology that's that's significant is a bigger tide, and within it, political systems are just flowing about. But that doesn't mean we should dismantle the ones we have in search of fairer, more just, better ones, particularly if they're empirically not working.
If we could come up with a way to reliably flatten inequality, that would be a good thing. But the empirical evidence suggests, so there's a bunch of things. It suggests, first of all, if you look at the attempts to alleviate inequality over the last 200 years, whether there were left-wing governments in power or right-wing governments in power made absolutely no difference whatsoever to the degree of inequality. The only things that have been reliably demonstrated to flatten out inequality are catastrophes. Wars, revolutions, epidemics. There's one other. War, revolution, epidemics. Well,
it's going to be some kind of horseman.
Now, that's right. It's another horseman. I can't remember which it is. But the price of radical redistribution seems to
It's
be tremendous
catastrophe.
death. Yeah, and no one has come up with.
Do you think that's because of how power functions? Because, like, you know, in an unequal system, whilst there are many people that are suffering, there are some people that are benefiting. I'm in a tier that benefits from the current economic situation. I drive a nice car, I have a nice house, I go where I want.
Well, let's look at that for a minute. Like, if you think about how that happened in your life, I bet I can tell you how it happened.
Go on.
Well, I mean, this isn't a personal account. But
it better be.
You had success.
Otherwise, I'm not interested.
Had success in one dimension, right? High success. But because you were successful in that dimension, all sorts of opportunities came your way. Like, my suspicions are that where you're sitting now, you have more opportunities than you can deal with. Is that correct?
Yeah,
right.
There are opportunities.
Right, exactly. Well, see, this is part of what seems to drive inequality, is that as you get successful, the opportunities that come your way start to multiply, and they don't multiply linearly, they multiply exponentially. And so when you start moving up faster and faster and faster and faster. And then you'll hit a point where you have so many opportunities that you don't even know what to do with them. And so it's a nonlinear improvement. But the downside of that is, and you might have had periods in your life that were like this too, where let's say you start to get depressed, and then you start to drink because you're depressed. And then you start to isolate yourself because you're drinking and you're depressed. And because you're drunk and depressed, then your friends start to abandon you. And then you lose your job. It's like you're not going downhill in a straight line. You're going downhill faster and faster and faster till you fall off a cliff. And that seems to be how the world works. It's like there's a center point. It's unstable. Things improve, then they improve exponentially. And things fall, and then they fall off exponentially. And that seems to be what's driving inequality. You start to succeed, and the probability that you'll continue to succeed starts to expand. And we don't know how to control that. And well, here's some other examples of it, though, because I said you couldn't lay it at the feet of capitalism. The same thing happens to cities. A small proportion of the cities get all the people. So some cities grow like mad, and others fail catastrophically, like Detroit. It applies to the mass of stars. So there's a very few stars in the Milky Way that have most of the matter. So it applies to the height of trees in the jungle.
Right. And you think if things are applicable in cosmology and in biology, the way that they are, their application politically and sociologically becomes less relevant because you see these phenomena as being broader than meliorism. I don't think human interaction.
I don't think it's less relevant. I don't think the left-wingers are pessimistic enough about the problem. They say inequality is a problem. It's inequality is a problem. Like it's a terrible problem. But then they say, well, it's probably a function of our political and economic systems, and we could fix those. It's like, no, it's not a function of our political and economic systems. Or if it is, it's at such a deep level that we don't know what drives it, and we certainly don't know how to control it.
But does that not mean, Jordan, that would you then reject any attempt to alter systems in favour of fairness? Because it seems to me that the focus is on, and as it would be for a clinical psychologist, individual change. Now, part of my personal experience is without individual change, social change is sort of irrelevant. And many great gurus would say...
You answered it right then and there. It's like, because I am concerned with inequality, say, and with social instability. And I thought about it for a long time. I knew that the left-wing approaches tended to fail catastrophically. And the right wing, of course, isn't particularly concerned with inequality, so that's irrelevant.
The left wing fails and the right wing don't care.
Yeah, that's right. That's fundamental.
So we need to
They also don't see the danger sufficiently. And the right wing also tends to think that the spoils go to who deserves them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of true, but it's not completely true. So that's part of that.
No, because we're not all... Because, of course, and what from a leftist perspective would be that we're not starting from a level playing field.
And the system isn't perfect at selecting.
This is why I think a spiritual solution, but something that is beneath or beyond material, is the only way that true progress is likely to be achieved. I was thinking of this, something that you said before about, we were talking briefly about kindness and compassion, and it occurs to me, and this is, I'm sure, very simplistic, but the heroism itself, by which I mean sacrifice, the willingness to sacrifice yourself for a greater idea. What excites me about that idea, and I believe why the phenomena is so loaded, is if someone is willing to die for something, it's that they believe it's bigger than them, or in fact that that their self is not the truest thing, that there is something greater. If I will give my life for another person, it's almost an acknowledgement of oneness, the temporalness of the individuated self. And we all work so hard to achieve individuation, and I'm sure much of your work as a clinical psychologist is guiding people towards it. But for me, it is just a temporary resting place, because having had the kind of experiences of personal humiliation, annihilation, success, failure, decimation, all of these things, that what I've been led to and what I continue to struggle with is how do I serve? How am I of service? How do I help people?
I think that is the solution to the problem. It's like, I don't think the solution to the problem of inequality is sociological. I think it's psychological. I mean, partly what I'm trying
Why? Because it's closer to essence? Because it's more essential? Or because a society has to be a reflection of individual psyches or collective psyches? Why is it psychological?
I think the temptation towards resentment and destruction that's associated with sociological approaches to inequality is too great, and that as a consequence, those movements tend inexorably to become corrupt and destructive. Because I think Orwell put his finger on it when he said that middle-class socialists don't like the poor, they just hate the rich. And that hatred, I think that hatred gets the upper hand in sociological movements. I think that the best approach to ameliorating inequality is to strengthen the individual.